this is one huge mess. It affects us in different ways, and because we may have different objectives or because we have different experiences, we may have different problems with the federal government. But I don't think too many people would argue that it's going in the right direction.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that point up. So I guess one of the things that I want to really dive into is how are you planning to make some of these changes? I know you spoke about authoritarianism, and I want you to dive a little bit deeper in what's your philosophy, because as you stated, we're living in a social state where the state essentially is being authorized. It's kind of dictating what we're doing, and so I've watched some videos and talked this out, and you had an interesting idea, using more of a private sector to dictate our social norms and how our social society should be driven. So I dive a little bit into that.
Sure, I appreciate that. And I actually believe that there's very little that our government needs to do that the private sector couldn't do. In many cases, we've gotten used to the public sector doing things, and it seems natural. It seems second nature for us to defer to our government. But there's actually, in my view, very little that we need to rely on the government that the private sector can't handle for itself. So, for example, maybe this conversation goes better with examples, and then we'll bring it together with an overarching philosophy. But as one of the primary examples, I do believe that one of the biggest problems we have in the United States is our crappy schools. Having raised a couple of kids, gone through public schools and private schools in Virginia and in Florida, I can tell you that the way our primary and secondary school systems work is not up to the standards of either other nations. The public schools are typically not up to the standards of the private schools. And none of it is up to the standards that we would expect from other industries. Other major industries in the United States just work better than our school systems do. Our school systems have not made a lot of progress, I would argue, for 50 years in terms of working better or, either as a matter of cost efficiency or in terms of results. And I believe that there is no coincidence between the fact that this is the most protected, monopolized industry in the United States, and it is one of the most frustratingly underperforming industries in the United States.
And I want to make sure are you talking about primary, or are you talking about secondary, collegiate?
Primary and secondary, not higher, not colleges.
Okay.
It has been tradition that the college system in the United States has been the envy of the world. We are quickly losing that. But I believe that we're still a step ahead of the rest of the world. And I think that that's largely because it's maintained in the private sector, whereas most of the rest of the world's universities are managed in the public sector. But having said all of that, the idea that you would take money for primary and secondary education and use it to acquire educational services and then grant a monopoly over a local area, first of all, that's weird. I mean, you would never do that in any other business, right?
I wouldn't say there's any sort of monopoly, because there's no ban on private schools. Private schools absolutely exist in every single
No, that's not really true. That's first of all, empirically, that's not true. There's any number of places that don't have private schools.
Especially Christian schools, especially religious schools.
Well, in Broward County, Florida, you've got half the county doesn't have a private school.
I mean, I can't speak to your specific county, but
I think Seth
I would say
I'm thinking Seth saying that.
Right, but you can't call it not a monopoly. You're only giving one school the money.
Well, no, I'm saying there's no one stopping someone from not creating a school. The money is,
for example, Jesse, the public schools are the only ones that get the money.
Well,
So you think that federal money should be spent towards private schools? Because their money is there. If it's a private industry, it should be able to withstand on its own market. Nobody's restricting people from going to private schools. If there's a private school that exists in the area and is profitable enough, you can take your kids there and you can spend your money and put your kids in a private school. Shouldn't the market forces be filling in space there? Like there's no restriction against going to a private school.
yeah, because I think private
You
school
should
for
be able
me
to
is
compete with
a
public
choice.
schools, right?
Okay, we need to come back to that because a lot of what you just said is just not factually correct. But go ahead, we'll come back to it.
My idea is that the most private schools are about choice, not about education. They want to choose how they educate their child, and so when you have that, the option of choice, that should be fundly, supported by the government, because a choice is a choice. Government provides a basic standard so that we all can, have a functional society. But if you decide to do something else in terms of you want your child to be raised a certain way or some kind of moral standard, that's your choice, and then that you should bear the cost of your own choice. It shouldn't be society should do it. I mean, I think we talked earlier about the founding fathers, how they established this two system where we're not a religious state. But we're here to provide basic needs of civility to citizens, and citizens ultimately decide how they want to govern their lives, and that's the point of the duality of it. Is there's structure and freedom, but it's not freedom without structure.
Yeah, I mean, I went to a private school until about 6th grade, and I'm not going to say that public schools don't have certain things that teachers might teach that you wouldn't disagree with, but I was the way all my other education alongside of our science education, we went to a Christian school and we were taught that the earth is 6,000 years old, and we would watch videos and we were told to
None
I'm
of
just saying
this
we were
has
told to
anything
boo.
to
It matters because the fact that these schools it would be the standard that you can just go to any sort of Christian school and that's your education, not something that's goes alongside or outside of basic educational standards. Like you can teach them anything if it's a completely privatized system, right? You can
look, no one is
literally
advocating. We've gone well beyond where we started. There's several layers that we've put on top of this. We need to unpack this one step at a time. No one is advocating for crappy education. I hope no one suggests that any of us would disagree on that point. No, what I'm talking about is we have effectively created a monopolistic system. Look, let's at least agree on the basic facts, okay? We can then we can talk about whether things are good or bad. Yeah. But we have effectively created a virtual monopoly by deciding that we're going to take public money and only give it to one provider. That's the definition of a monopoly. Okay?
I mean, there's a bunch of different schools. It's not just one school.
We only give the money to one school. If you want to go to that school, you can do it for free. Or you can go to another school and pay all of the cost. That's not a market system. That's not a competitive system. This is the reason why in many places there are no private schools. In most of the areas where there is no second choice, where there is no private school, it's in a poor neighborhood because poor families cannot afford a private school. So in the poor
areas, they also get crappy schools because public schools are funded by property taxes. And that's a form of institutional racism where if you're born into a poor neighborhood, you're going to get a shitty underfunded school because the neighborhood that's funding it has poor property value. So I agree that the public system is inefficient in certain ways. Exactly.
There is no private school. Because it's not profitable. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that was it was cutting off a little bit, but that was all I had to say.
There's no private school because the families can't afford a private school, right?
That would be
The
a market failure, right?
It's a market failure because all the money is given to
if the
one.
private, sorry, it's cutting out a little bit.
Go ahead.
They should in theory be able to start a private school now, and it should be profitable, right? There's not an institution to starting a private school. What you're saying is that the private schools, if they're more efficient and more effective, then they should be able to start on their own and compete, and they should draw students away from that. The problem with taking away from public schools,
that is the way we would want it, but we can't because they're competing against a school that gets to offer free tuition.
Why is that a bad thing?
That's not a competitive system.
Is there any situation in which, maybe somebody wouldn't be able to afford spending money out of their pocket to go towards a private education for their children? Like, there's a reason why we have this barrier. It creates more economic opportunity and equality than any other.
No, Seth.
Form
look,
of policy.
I think we're just not. I think we're talking past each other.
Yeah, you guys are.
We don't have a basic set of facts here. This is how. Let me describe how the system works, and then you tell me if you think I've said something wrong. Public money is given to only one provider in each area. You're with me so far, right?
In each school district, they have a school for each school district.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like a public option for education.
Right. The public, in a lot of places, there's school choice programs, but if there's not a school choice program, the money goes to one public school, one provider. Now, in some cases, you have a choice about which public school to go to, but if there's not a public choice, if there's not a school choice program, the money only goes to the public schools. That's the typical model in the United States for the past 200 years, right? If you
Sure.
Okay. If you want to start a private school to compete with the public school, you can. You're right. But there are two big barriers. One is that the state has to approve your agenda. To your point, you were saying, your example, you don't want a Christian school teaching kids things that were wrong. Right. I would argue that it's a family's choice about what that agenda is. I think that teachers and school boards ought to be, more under the control of local families, which is the basic model in the United States up until really 40 years ago, when the school boards and teachers began exerting a great deal more control. But that's a minor issue in the grand scheme of things. The major issue is that it's very difficult to compete against zero tuition, right? Especially in a poor neighborhood. In a poor neighborhood, families find it very difficult to afford private school tuition. And so the public school can be a lot worse, not just a lot worse, but a lot worse than a private school option. And a lot of families would still have to choose it because they wouldn't be able to afford private education. Now, so far, we haven't said anything about whether that's good or bad. I'm just describing the situation, right? This is what we call a virtual monopoly. And it's an actual monopoly where there are no private schools. You've only got public schools because in a lot of poor neighborhoods, there are no private schools that can function because the families can't afford them. Now, what I'm suggesting is that is not the way any other industry in America is set up. It is not the way that you would want any business in America to be set up. I mean, if you were deciding, from the get-go, from your druthers, how you would set up any business, you wouldn't say, well, I'm going to pick out one provider and I'm going to give it all of the money. And if anybody wants to compete with it, they're going to have to, overcome that difference. You would not expect that to go well. Now, if you layer on top of that the idea that the one provider you pick out is controlled in the public sector, well, that might create further problems. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I think that empirically speaking, we've seen in a lot of places it does create plenty of problems because of the way that school boards are controlled. Sometimes the state government shoves down the throats of local school boards how they want things to work. We saw problems with that in Florida and in other states. And it's not easy all the time to control a school board. To your point, it's not always easy to control a private school either. There are plenty of management problems in private schools. But my point is that if you were designing an industry from scratch, you would not expect things to go well if you were to pick out just one provider and say, these are the people to whom we're going to give all the money and everybody else is going to have to scratch and claw. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, in your situation, you're where there would be no option other than a shitty public school. That would be a bad situation to be put in. And I personally think we should switch to a much more efficient, fair form of funding these public school systems in which, it's more equitable, and the schools that are suffering obviously are the ones more deserving of public spending versus a really rich neighborhood that's just like pumping money into their football stadium or something like that, just like completely.
Sure, but empirical data suggests that the biggest problems are not differences in money.
I mean, that's not true at all. I mean, there's obviously bad, poorly run schools that have plenty of money, like in New York State, and there's tons of different reasons why that's not efficient. But the most
right, but in poor areas of Florida, there are plenty of bad public schools that get far north of $10,000 and the order of $15,000 per head. Private schools are competing with that favorably, both in terms of outcomes and in terms of expenses. The data show that the public school system does not operate effectively either in terms of outcomes or in terms of efficiency.
Yeah, but also what you were saying is the United States is underperforming plenty of other nations, but there's not a single nation that relies heavily on privatized education that way. Every single one of them is a more efficient form of public education. So I don't know where you're drawing an example of a system that would work better than a more functioning public education system.
I think what I'm saying is it's hard to imagine a system that works worse than the one that we have.
There would be. It'd be a fully privatized system, and that's what preceded public education.
Why would you expect it to be worse?
Because it absolutely was worse, and less students got health or got education. There's less.
Well, the empirical data today suggests that, for example, charter schools outperform, whether they're unionized or not. They typically outperform the non-charter public schools.
Well, I think that's a little misleading. Most charter schools are funded by parents, and most parents are more vested in education than what you face at the.
It's not a fair fight, to your point.
Yeah, that's not a fair fight.
I agree, but I don't think that it would be easy to come up with a system that's worse than the one that we have now.
No, I think
we're not last on earth in education. There's absolutely worse.
No, we're not. But the way that we've structured it is bound for failure. There's no other industry in America where you would advocate for public funding of one competitor at the expense of the others. Am I right about that, or is there another example?
There's several examples.
There's plenty.
In different industries. The banking industry, for example, in 2008.
You would advocate for a public sector solution instead of the private sector?
I would advocate that in 2008. That was the reason why our recession / depression didn't get as deep as it once was, because publicizing certain companies over others, because they had fundamentally the most amount of impact on American citizens. We did that with not only with the banking industry, we also did that with the auto industry. Government is supposed to be there to protect the fall of
the reason we had a crash in 2008 is because there was a housing bubble that burst. The reason that we had a housing bubble that burst is because the federal government pressured financial institutions, banks, not just through the Community Reinvestment Act, but through regulatory pressure to extend credit to new groups of people that they did not have experience with.
That was a banking deregulation under Bill Clinton. They weren't pressuring you to do predatory lending. That's a different thing. It's an issue of capitalism.
What regulatory restructuring are you talking about? You talking about?
I don't have it pulled up, but Bill Clinton in the 90s absolutely deregulated the banking industry, and I don't have it off the top of my head.
No. Look, we got rid of the separation between investment banking and deposit banking, but that had nothing to do with the housing bubble. The housing bubble was driven by commercial banks extending greater credit into places where they did not have experience, particularly experience once a recession hit. And when the bubble burst, I'm not making an argument, I'm just explaining what happened.
Yeah.
When the bubble burst, these markets went south in a hurry and took down a lot of financial institutions. But you cannot argue that it was in the absence of pressure from the federal government to open up these markets. That was what the Community Reinvestment Act was all about. On top of that, what led the burst was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac going down because they were undercapitalized. The reason that they were so undercapitalized is because the federal government was standing behind them and allowed them to expand into trillion-dollar organizations, which they were all too happy to become. They made billions of dollars for their taxpayers. For their shareholders.
Yeah.
Right. And these organizations were encouraging commercial banks to get into these markets, to take these risks. The commercial banks were happy to do it because, they didn't have all that much capital involved either. They had federal guarantees for the deposits that they raised. So they kept expanding as well and lending into these markets. When it burst, Fannie and Freddie went down. A bunch of commercial banks went down. They brought a bunch of investment banks with them, locked up financial markets, and tipped us into a horrific recession. All of which could have been avoided if we didn't have these federally chartered organizations like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, if we didn't have guarantees on these commercial banks' deposits, if we hadn't bailed out commercial banks a generation earlier, teaching these bankers that they could take risks and not suffer consequences themselves personally, and make a lot of money on the way up. There's a lot of public policy that was really bad leading up to that situation. But that all suggests that we need less. The experience of 2008 suggests that you need less federal intervention in these markets, less guarantees of commercial banks, less guarantees of organizations like Fannie Mae and like Freddie Mac. If you had, less guarantees and less insurance and less bank bailouts, these organizations wouldn't have misbehaved so badly in the first place.
I think I would disagree with that because the reality is human society doesn't change mostly. If you seem you're a very big historian. As you see, what happens with privatization is study economics. It shows that most people, when they have no limits or rail guards, they tend to want to acquire more. So if you go straight to privatization of industries, these industries are going to want more. You're saying about the banking industry, you said, well, it was just because the government was subsidizing a lot of them, and so they felt comfortable taking all these high risk. Essentially, I'm oversimplifying what you're saying, but the reality is the banks got greedy because they saw there was money there. They saw there was more opportunity for money, so they wrote loans that they knew the people didn't qualify for, and that isn't the fault of government. That's the fault of just human nature. That human nature is for us to take more when there's more available. And
I don't think that's true, Jesse. I don't think the historical record backs you up on that.
In terms
I
of
think
what?
that banks are more conservative when they are not backed up by the federal government.
No, because but
what would you suggest? Like in the 2008, like millions of more people would have lost all their money if we had not bailed out these banks in the first place. And I'm very against corporate bailouts and subsidies. I'm left libertarian, so I'm pretty suspicious of large corporations and their predatory practices. But this is more like an issue of government being controlled by these corporations in the first place. And especially I'm curious what your thoughts on campaign finance are, because I hear a lot of libertarians with different perspectives on that.
Let's wrap the banking industry, though. The reason that banks take so many risks is because they don't have a great deal of capital. And the reason that they don't have a great deal of capital is because their shareholders and their creditors don't require that of them, because there are federal government guarantees for all of their deposits. They're able to raise money in ways that their creditors believe is without a great deal of risk. Commercial banks would be much, much more conservative, which is what I think you would want if the government weren't standing behind them. And remember that the two biggest disasters that led to the 2008 failure were Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This was not a situation that was led by commercial banks. This was a situation that was led by the collapse of Fannie and Freddie. And not only did they fail to have either a 6% or 8% capital threshold like huge banks and medium-sized banks respectively were required. These are organizations that had something like 2% capital. And the reason that they had such small capital was because the federal government was standing behind them. And they expanded to become trillion-dollar organizations. You're absolutely right, in my view, that these are private sector organizations that got carried away. But the reason that they got carried away is because they could. And the reason they could was because they had federal backing.
Well, I would counter that, because as you see now, banks are always they're in their business of future earnings. That's what they do. So they're always going to overreach to show profitability to their stockholders. That's just the way. That's the nature of the business. So to sit there and say that, well, the banks are, if the government gave them this extra comfort to be aggressive and to show their stockholders value, I don't think that's going to stop. I think they're going to continue to anticipate prime example, and I know we had to move on.
You're saying there's no way to get the government out of it?
No. What I'm saying is government and private industry has historically worked better when they work together versus one trying to eliminate the other. That's my main point. Taking out one and not dealing with the other issue is just disaster, because private industry can't regulate itself. I mean, this is going back to even Teddy Roosevelt and his idealism. But the reality is private industry left by itself will never be able to control its innate driving force in it, which is profitability. It's impossible.
That's right, but long-term profitability is not what we see in the banking industry because of the government intervention. With other industries that are less regulated, that is what you see, is you see greater long-term drive toward profitability. But in the banking industry, you see these boom-bust cycles because they take ridiculous risks because they have this asymmetric portfolio of what happens when they do well versus what happens when they do poorly. Yeah. When they do poorly, the federal government takes it in the shorts. And so it's in their interest to take these enormous risks. I think that we all agree that that's not the way we want the system to work.
So if we're going to talk about campaign financing, I want to make sure you had the last word on the banking, because I know Seth wanted to talk about the campaign financing.
Yeah, I mean, my biggest concern with corporations is their, like Jesse was saying, their innate interest towards profitability.
Sure.
And they're like the goal under capitalism of a corporation is to consolidate competition.
And what is what's the problem with the profit motive in your view?
I think there's I'm a big proponent of markets and profit. I think it depends on.
You were saying the biggest problem with corporations is their innate drive for profit. I'm saying what is problematic about that?
Well, let me finish. Yeah, their innate drive towards profit leads them to it's an endless form of profit where they need to consolidate competition so that they can control prices, and that makes an inherent conflict of interest if you're wanting to preserve a free market when every single firm in the market is trying to create a non-free market.
Agreed.
And we've seen.
So you would believe in the Sherman Antitrust Act playing a more robust role in promoting competition?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, profit leads corporations to take advantage of small businesses primarily, which I'm sure you would say small businesses are the solution towards more competition, right?
Well, it depends on what you mean by small businesses. There are not too many markets, not zero, but there aren't too many markets in the United States that don't have some competition. The empirical data show that as long as you have 3 competitors, you don't have a lot of price control. But that's sort of on a case by case basis. It sort of depends on the nature of the market.
Yeah, there are tons of enterprises and industries in which smaller and smaller amounts of businesses are consolidating competition, and we had like giant conglomerates in the early 1910s that owned every single business, and it all stemmed up from one giant conglomerate. And that's something that, like I was mentioning, is like we were a classical liberal society, and we have tested and seen the results of certain policies, tons of the policies that you were advocating for. And we've seen many of them fail because of giant monopolization of industry. And we're a less monopolized industry in certain ways than we were at that time, absolutely. But certain wealth inequality continues to grow and continues to consolidate. And this gives a certain amount
okay,
of
but
private
we're
power.
mashing up some unrelated concepts there.
Well, I'm leading to something.
Okay.
Here. It's private authoritarianism, private control over society is just as dangerous as state control over society.
Why is that?
Because the private industries end up controlling the state.
How?
Also, they control legislation. Would you contend that legislation is mostly controlled by corporations at this point?
No, it's not mostly controlled by corporations. Corporations have huge influence over legislation, and that's a real problem, particularly when it affects industrial policy. But mostly, no, of course not. Most legislation through state legislatures is just, wacky, unproductive crap that, is driven by weird social pressures. A lot of weird corporate pressures too. But aside from corporations controlling the legislature, which I think is a governance problem as much as it is a business problem, I don't think it's fair to compare the authoritarianism that a government can wield over your life with control in a particular industry by a company. Yes.
Well, there are different forms of authoritarianism. Okay, the government absolutely has a monopoly over power and violence, and that's something that the corporations can't necessarily take over. Although some libertarians would argue for private corporations to have private armies and private military or police stations, stuff like that. So they're advocating for the same forms of power and violence, but just
let's not get off the beaten path.
I don't think
it's fair to use the same word to describe a government's monopoly over the use of force, to use that same term to describe a corporation's control of pricing in some particular industry. I think that's
I'm just saying you could theoretically do a similar form of authoritarianism if you really had all privatized systems, which is not necessarily what you're advocating for. You still
I don't know anyone that's advocating for that.
Oh, I've definitely talked to anarcho-capitalists.
Well, okay, that's great.
We're getting off a little off topic.
You found some fruit loops.
I know. I'm a little off topic here.
But okay. I don't think that if the word authoritarianism describes a government's monopoly over the use of force and the ability to impose certain social structures, then that same word cannot be applied to a corporation with a certain amount of control over pricing in some particular industry. Those are two very,
I'm
very
not
different
just
things.
talking about pricing. I'm just saying you have the government, which has its ways of being authoritarian. Okay, but you also go to a job every single day, and you spend 8 hours, 10 hours. It depends on which country you live in, and that is your private life as well. And corporations can absolutely control what you do with your private life. They can say, "Hey, I know it's your day off, but I really need you to come in." I'm
Well,
saying there are forms of
yes.
authority that private institutions have over you, whether or not it's the government with a monopoly of violence. They still have a coercive authority figure over you. There's definitely forms of
Well,
authoritarianism
look,
outside of government.
yeah, it is true that there are crappy work environments out there, but I think you belie your lack of fairness when you use terms like coercive and authoritarian. I mean, you're obviously motivated to make some case here. To be fair, though, there, I don't like to use the same language that we use for force and apply it to, a work situation. No one is advocate. I hope no one that we know is advocating for a corporation to have the right to use force. You can, even if you're a contracted employee, you can always quit. You can change
I mean,
employers. I'm not suggesting it's easy.
that doesn't make it better
And
necessarily. It doesn't
what's
mean
that?
you're not in the doesn't if you quit your job, that doesn't necessarily mean your next job will be better or outside of the same institutional hierarchies that exist in
No,
any
of
other private
course.
corporation.
It's
That doesn't make you any more free
working
necessarily if
is
you can just quit.
okay. But Seth, can we not
Yeah.
use words like freedom when talking about, you know, an employment contract? In the
Why?
United States, you are free
You're
to quit your job. You are free to change your
okay.
job. You are
Yep.
free. I think you'll agree with me that we all believe in your First Amendment right to form a union or
Sure.
any
Of course.
other bargaining group to try to leverage up power against your employer. Uh,
No, absolutely. I'm glad you
Entrepreneurs
support
will
that.
also tell you sometimes it's a rough day when your favorite employee quits too. But we
Yeah.
don't use words like lack of freedom and coercion and authoritarianism.
I mean, they absolutely apply. They might
No,
apply in
no, they
different
don't
ways.
apply in the
Yeah.
same
You could
sense
have
as they do to the
what's
use
all right.
of force.
I
Those
think our
are
key
apples and
distinction
oranges.
here is you're talking about a negative freedom when I'm talking about a positive freedom.
What's a
I'm talking about a
positive freedom?
freedom. Positive freedoms are freedom to pursue something, freedom to pursue something without, institutional barriers. And you're talking about a freedom from government specifically. Now, I think you should be free to
No, I
pursue
think that you
your
should be
talent.
free from other people,
Sure, sure.
whether you call that a government or not. I think that you should be free to make decisions for yourself.
I
And
agree.
that includes for whom you work and who you hire. It includes how you associate, how you conduct your employment negotiations. I think we're in agreement with all of that. I just don't like it when we adopt this weird language where we seem to.
Freedom and authoritarianism is weird language.
I think it's very weird
I'm
language
talking
to
about
appropriate
expanding
that
freedom.
language and use it
It's
in
not
labor
appropriating. It's
law.
just a difference of opinion.
I think we have perspectives, and
Yeah, I'm
perspective
just
is
talking about advancing more freedom. Okay,
okay,
you can have a more free society
If we do what?
when if we create a more equitable access to certain resources that everybody needs. Everybody needs healthcare and education. And that's not something we should create barriers for based on commodity, based on
And you
your
believe
market
that
value.
what's we when we create barriers? I think you're advocating to
Okay, yeah.
use the government to tell corporations
Well, I'm
what to
talking
do,
about
I
certain
guess.
forms of commodification.
What's that?
Commodification, privatization of things, creating a barrier towards education based on how much money you are worth. That is an institutional barrier towards education, towards a freedom, some way you can advance your own educational skills, ways you might be very capable of doing something, but nobody's going to hire you if you don't have their certificate of education through certain, higher education. And I think that many other countries around the world have showed you can create a lot more educated skilled workforce if you advance public education to the tertiary level, something like that, where you can some sort of positive freedom, creating more freedom for somebody so that they can have a more equitable society with more competition, with a higher skilled, a lot more workers in certain industries that you can incentivize by, taking away institutional barriers. You can make things like education and healthcare, not just for people seeking education and healthcare, but people trying to work in the healthcare industry. Like, you can create more nurses and doctors if you're not like, hey, you want to become a nurse or doctor? Well, you have to take on $200,000 of debt for the rest of your life. You sure you're going to be competent and this is definitely the career path for you? There's a lot of fear that keeps people from pursuing their freedoms, their desired and passions, things that they might be better at if instead they just choose something that's more safe. It's
right.
More
so you're using the word freedom to indicate an ability to get a free education.
Oh, I'm just talking about your freedom to pursue your own life. And education
Right, but the example you picked was to get a free education.
Oh, that's just an example. Education can be a barrier to you advancing, your own.
Well, of course it is. I mean, there's 1,000 barriers to success, and education is one of those things that has proven that an investment has to be made for there to be a certain level of success.
Yeah.
We know that. I don't like the appropriation again of this term barrier. To say that something
between you, right?
But there isn't anything. What you're suggesting that is the need to make an investment is somehow a barrier. I mean, you carefully choose these strange words that I think connote something that is not really quite accurate. What we mean is that education is expensive, and it is. What can we do to make it less expensive? We can, make sure that we don't accidentally throw up barriers to those who provide the service and those who want to obtain the service. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that we're going to be able to find some magic wand to make it less expensive. I think what you're suggesting is that we find a way to make someone else pay for it. I'm not suggesting that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's the core of your suggestion.
Not necessarily somebody else, but you would pay for it at different points in your life through taxation. You're still going to end up paying for your own education by being taxed.
Right. Well, that's what student loans do, right?
Yeah. And then that's the same idea. I just think it's less efficient, obviously. If you take an 18-year-old and say, hey, start off your life, start your career with loads and loads of debt and try to advance that's creating a barrier that didn't exist prior. Well, you're still going to end up paying for your education over time. But if that
right, but how would you suggest paying for higher education for someone who, didn't have the $100,000 or $10,000 or $300,000 to drop down? How would you suggest that be financed?
I mean, higher education is not even remotely expensive compared to anything on our budget. Do you know how much it costs? Between $40 and $80 billion at max. That's like 5% of our military budget. That is incredible.
No, I was just asking how you would, are you suggesting that we shift it to someone else paying for it, or are you suggesting that someone undertake that with debt? I think those are the only two choices, aren't they?
You could cut government spending, and that would still fund the system.
Right, so you're suggesting the government pay for it?
Yeah. Well, I'm saying you pay for it through the social service orchestrated by the government in some. I'm not saying we need.
No, Seth, I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm just asking, what would you do about higher education? You would have the government pay for it.
I'm saying you would pay it through taxes. People would pay for it, right? You'd still pay for it.
The government would pay for it.
Well, you're still paying for it.
I'm trying to agree with you. You're saying that the government would pay for higher education under your plan.
The government would fund public education, right? Free at the point of service. Yes, that's what they do in countless other social democracies around the world. And they have a lot.
Yeah.
ease of access to education, and they have a lot more, at this point, it's enough to, like, if you're in a job, they say, do you have a college a college degree? And that's enough of a disqualifier for you to not get a job, is just having a college degree. That's a barrier in its own to being to getting a good job, just being educated on its own. And that would create a more like competitive environment where you have to actually compete based on your merits, not just having gone to school and passed certain classes.
Agreed. It's not clear to me that it's in our society's interest to send more people to college these days rather than fewer. We're up to nearly 50%. And I think that the data are quickly showing that the value of a college education is declining rather than increasing. So it's not clear to me that we get a better outcome by socializing how we finance higher education. I think I would leave the system the way it is.
And we're going to stop the topic right here because we're at 11 p.m. And it was a great conversation, but I wanted to take
so much farther.
Yeah, I wanted to say I didn't want to. I know we promised.